Friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests, the choice facing humanity is extinction or regeneration. Looked at through the lens of the four seasons, we can see that humanity is currently in its summertime, a time of endless partying, of consumption, as if the planet has no boundaries. But the browning of the autumn leaves are starting to show as anxiety grows around the climate emergency and the collapse of nature. Continue as we are, and we face a perpetual winter. COVID-19 gave us a collective taste of that perpetual winter, showing that our society actually is fragile, is vulnerable, shouldn't be taken for granted. What we need is a new spring. The great news is that there are beautiful, life-affirming, compassionate solutions ready at hand to take us to that new spring. More on that shortly. But if we're to address those twin emergencies of climate and the collapse of nature and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, then we've got to focus on where we can have the most impact. So let's ask ourselves, what is the biggest land user on the planet? It's food. What accounts for 70% of freshwater use on the planet? It's food. What is responsible for a third of greenhouse gases, more than any other single sector? It's food. Food is where it's at. Food needs a big shake-up. When it comes to food and animal welfare and the environment, thankfully there's growing recognition of how the dots join. Greater understanding of the concept of one health, one welfare, that the health of people relies on the welfare of animals and a thriving environment. Essentially, we're all in it together, that harming animals harms people too. Now, at this point, I'd like to introduce my abiding inspiration, our rescue dog, Duke. Now, Duke, of course, like other animals, is a sentient being. He has feelings, needs, and wants, just like us, and he doesn't mind letting me know what they are. We live on a farm hamlet. It's our house, but not our farm, which means that we have all of the view and none of the work. What could be better? Duke loves to bond with our neighbours, the 40 cows that graze the riverbank near home. Duke and I are out whenever we can on a daily basis, looking through the fields and the forests. And I love to see how the countryside changes every single day. But there's one day that always sticks in my memory. Duke and I were out early morning in the springtime, and there was a tractor pulling a plough. Up and down the tractor went, making its lonely furrow. Dust was going into the air, catching the sun, creating an aura. A classic countryside scene. But there was something wrong. There was something missing. There were no birds, no gulls screeching behind the plough in search of an easy meal of worms. I took a closer look. I could see that the tractor was ploughing over a public footpath, so I could get a bird's eye view of the soil just as it had been upturned. And do you know what I saw? Nothing. Not a worm, not a beetle, not a bug trying to crawl back in their burrows with the soil just been turned upside down. It was lifeless. It was sand. We could have been walking on the moon. That field was being planted with maize, corn, a common animal feed. It was being grown using chemical pesticides and artificial fertilizers, which were destroying the soil ecosystem, breaking it down, the soil running into the local river where the cows are. It put me in mind of seeing the flowing green oceans of monoculture corn while I was in the Midwest of America in Nebraska. Much of that corn being used to feed factory farms, chickens, pigs, and cows. I saw the feedlots where hundreds, if not thousands of cattle were standing in cramped, barren pens, not a blade of grass in sight. The sun was intense. They had no shade, which is why I could see them jostling for respite, trying to lie down in each other's shadow. It was a potent example of the factory farm regime that has been ravaging the planet. But it doesn't have to be like this. In fact, it hasn't been like this for very long. Factory farming was born just a single lifetime ago when we started to remove farmed animals from the land and put them into cages and confinement. Which looks like a space-saving idea, doesn't it? But actually isn't, because we then have to devote vast acreages of arable land elsewhere to grow their feed. And those farmed animals are pretty damned ropey at converting crops into meat, milk, and eggs. So much so, they waste the vast majority of the calories and protein in conversion. Add it all up, and we waste enough food to feed 4 billion people every year in this way. That's half of humanity alive today. Factory farming is the biggest cause of food loss on the planet. It is the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet. It is the major driver of wildlife declines on the planet. And it is also undermining the very thing that the food system needs if it is to have a future: the soil. Which is why the UN has rightly warned that carry on as we are, and we have 60 harvests left in the world's soils. No soil, no food. Game over. We really do face extinction or regeneration. When governments come together outside of the UN Food Systems Summit of a couple of years ago and the stock-taking moment in July, which Stefanos is leading brilliantly, food barely gets a mention. When governments gather to talk about climate change or biodiversity, it barely gets a look in. It renders the latest COP, the Conference of the Parties, therefore, a cop-out. Food is the elephant in the room. Addressing that elephant in the room requires us to recognize that if we continue on the trend line, eating meat and dairy as we are, over-consuming, then our food alone could trigger catastrophic climate change. We need a new way. And this is where those beautiful, life-affirming, compassionate solutions come into being, because big change is inevitable. The one thing we can guarantee is that things are going to change. So what are those solutions? Well, I sum them up in broad brush as 3 R's. Regeneration, rethinking protein, and rewilding, not least the soil. Regeneration, bringing farmed animals back to the land as part of mixed rotational farms, where they can turbo boost soil health. They can feed the elephant's weight of biodiversity that should be under the ground. Because when I reflect on that wormless field, I reflect on the fact that there should have been millions of worms in every hectare, in every patch of field the size of a football pitch. There should have been 13,000 species of life weighing collectively as much as an elephant. 5 tons. That's what we've got to put back for all our sakes. So regeneration, rethinking protein, so reducing our reliance on animal products and rewilding the soil, bringing animals back, feeding the elephants biodiversity that should be under the soil, and thereby looking after the future of our food system. Farmed animals brought out of factory farms, living their best life, far fewer of them, but being given the opportunity to experience the joy of life. That is the way to this new dawn. The question is, how do we get there, and fast? Well, I think it requires all of us to come together. Civil society, governments, corporations, the finance sector, the United Nations, to craft a new way forward for food that moves us away from industrial agriculture, moves us away from factory farming. It requires us to build the biggest, most diverse and inclusive movement around the world, including the global south, of course, farmers and faith-based leaders. And on that latter point, I commend to you as essential reading the new book from Joyce de Silva, Animal Welfare in World Religion. Joyce will be signing copies at lunchtime. It requires us to embrace the fact that big change is inevitable. Let's make that change positive, because we no longer have the luxury of saying, we can't afford to change. Can we afford to change? The reality is, we can't afford not to. Friends, the time is right for food to take center stage, for us to come together and create a new global agreement on food, to move away from factory farming and that damaging way of creating food. We are beyond the 11th hour. We have 8 harvests left to save the Sustainable Development Goals, 60 harvests left to save the future for our children, for animals, people, and the planet. The clock is ticking. There is no time to lose. What we do now will define the next 1,000 years. Let's go to it. Thank you.